Good morning, News Talk 1330 WLBB. Adam Uglum here in the newsroom, hosting the Community Voice program today. Lots to cover, and really can't stay away from the whole presidential primary thing, especially with today being the New Hampshire primary, and it looks like Governor Mitt Romney's going to steal away that one today. Newt Gingrich certainly sliding down, I believe, to fifth place, depending on which poll you're looking at. Interestingly enough, Real Clear Politics has a nice collection of all the latest polls. And it's honestly quite enlightening to look at all these polls in one place. There's CBS News polls, there's Rasmussen polls, there are Gallup polls, Pew Research, Quinnipiac polls, public policy polling polls, Suffolk 7 news tracking. Just any poll gets plopped up on this website. So you can really, polling is one of those things where one poll says one thing and the other says the other. And it's really interesting to, as Real Clear Politics does for you, to kind of hop on and average them all together, because that's really, I think, a fairer shake at these things too, because polling companies, let's face it, do have certainly some partisan rulings, especially when you look at public policy polling, which is a Democrat polling organization, or CBS News, which is Democrat. Gallup tends to be fairly neutral in my experience, and Rasmussen tends to lean to the right. However, Rasmussen tends to also be the most accurate when it comes to presidential politics, from what I understand anyway. But interestingly enough, Romney is just littering the spread when it comes here. He's plus 4, plus 12, plus 17, plus 13, plus 24 when it comes to the New Hampshire polls here coming up, and especially for the Republican nomination. It looks like Romney's got a pretty strong lead, depending on which poll you look at, between 4 and 10 points as of right now. Now, the interesting thing about Mitt Romney is what we've always been told is that Mitt Romney can only garner so many, and the other candidates are just so bad that the strong showing of support that Mitt Romney has from around the country is just what keeps him in the lead. He never gets more than that 25, 26%, and everybody else, that other 75%, is looking for the not Romney, and they're just kind of torn on who the not Romney is. So it's very interesting, this presidential election. Pollsters don't really know what to do. They don't know what to predict. They don't know what to forecast. They don't know what this is going to look like, especially because if you look at historical trends, this is the first time that Republicans in history have polled like this as a primary polling season goes. Pollsters are really just kind of up in arms. Well, we don't know what to do, because this is unlike anything we've ever seen before and anything that history tells us that Republican polls look like. As a matter of fact, I've heard several pollsters, I believe Frank Luntz included in there, says that for the first time, Republicans are polling like Democrats are, as they traditionally do in primaries, with very volatile primary seasons. Very, very interesting, this primary season, and it looks like Mitt Romney is going to be the inevitable candidate. And if I know my listener base as well as I like to think I do, I assume you guys do not approve very well of Mitt Romney. Now, Santorum is another interesting mix in there, too. It looks like Santorum is the current, I guess you could call him the second frontrunner, but Ron Paul really is doing quite well as well. So it's very hard not to say that Ron Paul and Santorum are close seconds behind Mitt Romney. And it's going to be very interesting, because it's either going to be Mitt Romney or it could really be anybody's race at this point. It's hard to say just because Romney may win today. He's already won Iowa, even albeit very closely. And there's allegations of lots of voter fraud and interesting things going on in Iowa as well. So certainly making it, again, for a very interesting primary season. Now, one of the things that looking at polls shows me to be very evident of what's going on here is when you look at Obama versus the other candidates. Obama leads Rick Santorum by a spread of plus 7, according to Rasmussen Reports, a Republican-leaning pollster. Obama is leading by plus 1 to Ron Paul. That's a statistical possibility that Ron Paul could beat Obama on a national scale, and that's according to CBS News, a Democrat leading organization. Obama versus Perry, plus 7. Pretty solid win for Obama there. Obama versus Huntsman, also plus 7 for our current president. The only people who are even close to beating the occupier of the White House, President Obama, are Romney and Ron Paul. Those are the only ones that come statistically close to beating him. Romney at a statistical tie, really, with the president at plus 2, and Ron Paul with a statistical tie at with Obama at plus 1. So the margins of error usually for these types of things are between 1 and 5%, so it really could go either way. And those are really the only people who are close when it's a 1 versus 1 type thing. So it's interesting to look at that and then look at the way Romney is the huge frontrunner in all of the things. And I think it's because of that large base of Romney supporters who just feel that he is the inevitable. And the other 75% or so who don't like Mitt Romney are torn on who's the better alternative, because you've got big government Newt Gingrich, big government Rick Santorum as well. And that's the interesting thing. And I mentioned, I think, on my last program, and probably didn't cover it very well, that Rick Santorum is a big government conservative. If you liked President Bush, and many people don't realize how much of a big government guy President Bush was, and he had a lot that, he had a very interesting presidency as well. He had a lot of issues to face as well. So there's take this with a grain of salt. George Bush was a big government guy. Sure, he passed tax cuts, which is a very conservative thing to do, but many of his other policies kind of negate that when you look at it as a whole. He was a statist, put quite largely. He spent more than Clinton did, and Clinton spent more than Reagan did, if that puts it in perspective. Reagan really ramped up tax revenues, but it took a little while. We know that you can't just snap your fingers with some kind of policy and the economy just magically starts moving. Interestingly enough, that does happen sometimes, though, especially with things like capital gains tax and economic growth. Interestingly enough, the early part of the 90s, the first 6 years of the Clinton administration, just as a quick quibble here, the economic growth averaged at 4.4% leading up to 1996. Well, I believe it was 1996 or 1997 that Bill Clinton managed to get through the House and Senate a increase in the capital gains tax, which decreased capital gains revenue and also decreased economic output by 33%. Economic growth went from an average of 4.4% in his first 6 years of office to the last 2 years of his office. Economic growth shrunk to 3.3%. And you could almost argue, really, it's not completely out of the box to argue that the capital gains increase led to part of the economic collapse in the early part of the new millennia. So, again, the economy is very complicated. You cannot simply point to one thing and say, hey, that caused the economy. It's a multitude of things. You've got the Federal Reserve playing a big role. You've got tax policy playing a big role. You've got the natural flux of the economy playing a big role. You've got the world economy playing a big role in the economy, now that we're all tied together thanks to globalization, which is a good thing. It's very interesting, and that's about the best and simplest way. I hate to repeat myself, but man, this is one strange presidential primary, and it's interesting times we live in indeed. I'm glad to be living in the political climate that we live in now, because it's really, I think, going to be historically known as one of the most interesting presidential elections ever. I think times are so dire, this may be one of the most important elections in my lifetime. The current president and his Democratic Congress that he had his first couple of years managed to set the precedent to grow the federal debt by $5 trillion in his tenure in office. Now, the Congress is split, and Republicans really don't have a whole lot of power to cut the purse strings just controlling the House, because there is enough resistance both from Republicans and Democrats in the House to slow that process down, and Democrats still control the Senate as of right now, too. So it's really hard to say that Republicans have a whole lot of control right now when it comes to Washington, because they really don't. And the budget precedent, the spending precedents have already been set. President Bush signed in Medicare Part D, which is a completely unfunded, very expensive part of Medicare. And what do you do to stop it when you control one half of 1/3 of the government? It's a lame duck Congress. There's no doubt about it. And what do we do to stop what's going on here? We'll be back after the break. If you'd like to call and comment, we're going to get into Rick Santorum here for just a moment, and we'll also talk about Ron Paul, because everybody knows about Mitt Romney. They know he is the alleged frontrunner. Why? People argue about that. We'll be right back after the break. The show brought to us by Tanner Health System. Adam Uglum here, shooting from the hip, with just a couple of websites up to show you some polling data and things like that. We'll talk about Ron Paul, Rick Santorum, and I'm sure we'll talk about Mitt Romney a little bit more as well. But please feel free to call in if you have a question, comment, concern. Please do. The number is 678-601-8255. Again, the number is 678-601-TALK. Back after the break. Alrighty, good morning. News Talk 1330 WLBB. We are back. It's 8:41. And I'm trying to get into the habit of giving you a couple of quotes. Usually one to open the show and one to close the show, and I forgot to do that at the beginning of the program. And the first quote is from Frederick Bastiat, who wrote The Law just shortly before he died. It's a book I got over the Christmas break, and I've read little tidbits of it. Have not read it cover to cover just yet. Trust me, I will. Plenty of reading in my library. Got a giant stack of books, both between school reading and all the books that I'd like to read in the meantime. I would like to continue to share with you my reading list. Right now I'm actually pouring through Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. It's one of his simpler books on capitalism and why it's a good thing. It's a very interesting read, very well written, written by both he and his wife, Rose Friedman. I do recommend picking that up. It's very cheap on Amazon.com or somewhere. I'm sure you could probably get it at the local bookstore as well. But a great book, an easy read, and kind of dumbs down economics a bit. You can also get Economics in One Lesson, written by Henry Hazlitt. It's a bit more of a medium-level difficulty read on economics. If you're interested in reading economics, that's on my plate as well. But from Frederick Bastiat, here's a quote that I liked quite a bit. I do not dispute their right to invent social combinations, to advertise them, or to advocate them, and try them upon themselves at their own expense and risk. But I do dispute their right to impose these plans upon us by law, by force, and to compel us to pay for them with our taxes. And that is from Frederick Bastiat's The Law. A very short read. If you like short, thin books, The Law is for you. Trust me. My granddad was funny. He was excited about it. And I said, I got this book. I'll be done with it here shortly. And he's like, oh, good. It looks like a book I'd like a lot. It's nice and short. Granddad likes to read a lot, and he's always got, he reads a lot more books than I do. And especially the short ones, gets through those quite quickly. Real quickly, we're going to talk about Rick Santorum, and I mentioned previously on a program about his big governmentism, and thanks to Eric Erickson over at Red State, I have plenty of information to pass on to you via my website, and you can get that. Libertariat.wordpress.com is my blog, ran by yours truly, and I'm the only contributor, and between two jobs in school, it's a little tough to get posts regular there, but get a good 9-10 posts a week as of the last couple of weeks, and getting a lot of views, about 300 or so views a week on my website. So I appreciate my listenership for checking that out, and I've got many friends and family who like to read my posts as well. An interesting take from a young, interesting libertarian mind like my own. I make just about as many Republicans angry as I do Democrats, which is kind of fun to be in the middle and play both sides of the fence and make both sides angry. It honestly makes for very interesting conversation. It confuses a lot of those on the left who I actually anger quite a bit more. But please feel free to check out my article post from, when did I post this? Last night at 9 o'clock. Fact-checking Rick Santorum. Interestingly enough, in the New Hampshire debate, I believe it was ABC, because it was sappy Diane Sawyer doing the moderating. Why on earth? I don't understand. George Stephanopoulos and Diane Sawyer are not objective news reporters, much less objective moderators. They are Democrat Party officials as far as anything else goes. But interestingly enough, back to the debate, Rick Santorum, in a rebuttal to Ron Paul, said, I am not a libertarian. I actually do believe in government. And the conclusion there is that, well, true, you're clearly not a libertarian. And this is a very common straw man argument from Republicans, especially when it comes to libertarians. And even some conservative Democrats I know just automatically assume that libertarians for some reason are anarchists, which is a complete misconception, and it really detracts from the real argument here on the principle of good government. And it really bothers me a lot because it's a really simple and wrong case to make. I won't stay on it too long, but it's very clear Rick Santorum is not a libertarian, and Ron Paul very much is. Now, so what kind of conservative is Rick Santorum? Well, how conservative is he? Well, thanks to Eric Erickson, he dug through, and all of this information is his voting record from the Senate.gov website. And you can look at all of this. It's a very, very long list, and I'm just going to read a couple of these out for you to look at Rick Santorum's record. Rick Santorum voted for a taxpayer funding of the National Endowment for the Arts. He voted against a 10% cut in the budget for the National Endowment for the Arts. That is the government federal program that provides funding for aspiring artists across the nation. And as a libertarian, I can certainly tell you that the government has no role in buying art for the sake of buying art. And when it comes to bankruptcy, he voted for a Schumer amendment. If you don't know who Chuck Schumer is, he's a Democrat, a very prominent, very left-wing Democrat out of New England. He voted for a Schumer amendment to make the debts of pro-life demonstrators not dischargeable in bankruptcy. Defense and foreign policy, how conservative is he here? He voted for the Chemical Weapons Convention, voted against requiring the president to certify that the CWC is effectively verifiable. He voted to allow food and medicine sales to state sponsors of terror and tyrannical regimes such as Libya and Cuba. He voted to ban anti-personnel landmines, voted against increasing deficit spending offset by equivalent cuts in non-defense spending. He voted to limit the president's authority to impose sanctions on nations for reasons of national security. He voted to give $25 million in foreign aid to North Korea. Wait a minute. Hold on. I hadn't read this one yet. Voted to give $25 million. Now, the federal budget is, what, $3.8 trillion? So $25 million is like a fraction of 0.1% of our budget. But $25 million is a lot of freaking money, if you ask me. And that's money we sent to a completely communist, completely oppressive regime called North Korea. You're kidding me. He voted for Richard Paez to the Ninth Circuit judge in cloture. He voted for Sonia Stoudemire, voted for Richard Holbrooke, voted for Mary McLaughlin, voted for Tim Dyke, voted against the National Right to Work Act. I believe Santorum was a senator out of Pennsylvania. So, union's pretty strong up there. Kind of makes sense that he voted against the National Right to Work Act. However, that doesn't come across as very conservative, if you ask me, that Rick Santorum would vote against your right to work without having to pay union dues. If you're not familiar with how Right to Work Act work is, many people don't know because we are a right to work state here in Georgia, which means that, for example, I was in Vegas a few years ago, and our waiter at the casino said that he was a member of the union, and he is forced to be a member of the union as it's not a right-to-work state. And waiters there get like $16-17 an hour due to union rules at casinos, interestingly enough, plus tips. I still left him a good tip because he was a good waiter, but I can't believe he told us all this. He'd been waiting tables for a long time, didn't seem to care. But if you want to wait tables in Nevada, you have to pay union dues. You do not have a choice. And the line of thought there is that if you're going to benefit from what the union's actions provide you, that you must pay the dues. So again, it does restrict entry to the labor force because you have to pay union dues by force of law, which to me is not a very conservative thing. Now, both Mitt Romney and Santorum believe in a different type of conservatism that I do, and which is interesting here is that conservatism is something that is completely subjective. Now, back in the late 1840s, really the early 1840s even, Lincoln and the Democrats, Lincoln being the first Republican president, there was this ongoing debate about who were the conservatives, and the national rhetoric, both in the media and by the political parties, were that the Democrats were the conservatives. They were trying to conserve the old way, and that's what the word amounts to, is what are we trying to preserve here? And that's what the argument on conservatism really boils down to. Democrats are trying to conserve the status quo, and conservatives are trying to conserve the Constitution. And that was the case that Abraham Lincoln was making. Abraham Lincoln used Thomas Jefferson's language from the Declaration of Independence and his following writings over the next 40 years of his life to make the case for freedom. Lincoln said, look, we are conserving the Declaration of Independence. We are the true conservatives. You Democrats, you who do not support freedom for our colored brethren, you are not the true conservatives because you clearly do not want to conserve the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, neither of which mention skin color. We are the real conservatives, and over time that's changed, and Democrats have become the liberals, and Republicans have become the conservatives. Now, over the last 100 years or so, party lines have certainly changed. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party are not remotely the same as they once were. Now, they certainly do have similarities. Racism in the Democratic Party goes all the way up into the late 70s and 80s even. And even 30 years ago, the parties were completely different than they are today. But, Robert Byrd, a Democrat, filibustered. It was one of the longest filibusters in the Senate at the time, filibustered the Civil Rights Act. He was a big-time Democrat. Big-time Democrat. John F. Kennedy even held on to a desegregation of federal housing bill, hung on to that for days and days and days. I think he waited months to sign that piece of legislation. So there's little hints of racism or anti-just law when it comes to the Democratic Party throughout the last 50 years even. So it goes far beyond just the 1800s, which is, interestingly enough, the Democrats like to ignore their platform I mean, they like to say, well, we're part of the Jeffersonians. We're part of the original Democratic Party, which is funny because Jefferson was actually the founder of the original Republican Party. The party was called Democratic Republicans. It was not called the Democratic Party. It was Democratic Republicans when Thomas Jefferson founded the party. It was the Jacksonian Democrats that had the real divide in the 1800s, so be careful who you get your history from. I mean, the first official Democratic Party platform was pro-slavery, and the platform for, I mean, and you can get this from the Constitutional Congress, the Congressional Library, rather. You can get this. This is the official platform for a half century, was a pro-slavery, pro-state rights, pro-conservatism platform from the Democratic Party. That's what it was. So their history is very much littered with much racism, and you cannot find that nearly to the same degree in the Republican Party, especially going back that far. The Republican Party was the anti-slavery, pro-civil rights party platform after Lincoln came into office. And the Emancipation Proclamation was from Abraham Lincoln, a Republican president. People tend to forget that. And when I say people, I mean moderates and Democrats like to forget that it was Republicans who passed, let's see, I believe it was 12 federal laws. There was a Civil Rights Act of, funnily enough, I believe it was 1865. There was a Federal Civil Rights Act, which was later repealed after gerrymandering became popular and launched Democrats back into the control of Congress right up to 1900. So there's a little history lesson for you. And again, Rick Santorum is a big government conservative. It's hard to call Newt Gingrich a big government conservative. He has said some things that certainly make him out to be a big government conservative, but he's not nearly the big government conservative that Rick Santorum is and Mitt Romney are, who both make the case that it is the federal government's position to preserve societal norms and societal values. It is our job to use the law to preserve what we believe is the ideal society. Now, to me, that's not very conservative, because a conservative believes in individualism, believes that society does not need the federal government to uphold itself, and that's my personal take on it. I do not think it is the proper role of the government to preserve society. It is the federal government's role to preserve the individual, to be just in its laws. Should the federal government be in the position to discriminate against anyone? And 99.9% of people are going to tell you, well, no, the federal government shouldn't discriminate against anybody. Yet we have laws that pertain differently to different colors of people. We have laws that pertain differently to different incomes of people. We have laws that pertain differently to different genders of people. Just law, in my opinion, and I do hope you agree, justified law affects all people equally. Everyone should be equal under the law. Now, rhetorically, no one disagrees with that, but when you get down to the nuts and bolts of things, people disagree quite clearly. Oh, well, we should have a progressive income tax. Rich people should pay progressively more in income taxes. We should discriminate against them because they've been successful. Okay, way off topic now. It's what I get for shooting from the hip. We'll be back after the break. It's 55 degrees, 55 minutes into the hour. 5 minutes in the program when we get back. The telephone number is 678-601-TALK. Alrighty, just about 4 minutes left in the program, and I got a lot of things to get out here, and going to try and keep the pace here a little slow, because I know I tend to talk a little too fast here. Big deep breath. Okay, on my website, libertariat.wordpress.com, you can find later today a YouTube video of this program, likely with a cool picture of a fleur-de-lis, since that is my theme. That's a story for another program. Anywho, wanted to talk a little bit today about how people like Ron Paul except for his foreign policy. Now, on my website later today, you'll also find, I will post George Washington's farewell address delivered on September 17th, 1796. George Washington's farewell address. And Ron Paul and George Washington have very similar foreign policies. And I know it's a totally different time, 215 years ago. So take it with a grain of salt, but it's a good read. His farewell address from 1796, and stack that up with the way Ron Paul handles foreign policy. And before I leave you, again, I want to go back to the polls. Ron Paul and Mitt Romney are the only two people who are polling statistically tied or statistically winning or statistically losing, close enough, near enough to the president. Everybody else in the presidential race right now is losing by 5 to 8 points. According to CBS News, according to Rasmussen Reports, according to Gallup, according to Pew Research even. Romney leading by 11 in that Pew Research. And this is so amazing to look at the fact that almost every polling company says that the president is largely disapproved of on a national scale. Rasmussen says disapproval spread plus 11. Gallup says disapproval spread plus 8. The country, by and large, not a big fan of the president's job performance so far, yet they are very willing to re-elect President Obama if we nominate, and this is according to the polls right now, if we nominate Huntsman, Perry, Santorum, or even Bachmann, but she's out of the race. So if we nominate those, according to the polls right now, Obama will be re-elected. The only two who have a shot at winning, according to the polls today, are Ron Paul and Mitt Romney. Are they the two choices? How will Ron Paul and Mitt Romney especially perform in the Southeast once we get to the South Carolina, Virginia, and Florida primaries? Those will be some of the determining factors. That we'll pretty much know who the candidate will be after those primaries. But I cannot stress how important it is to realize that, at least for right now, the only two who come close to beating Obama on a national scale are Ron Paul and Mitt Romney. Those are the only two that come close to beating Obama, are Romney and Paul. Cannot say it enough. Cannot say it enough. Hope you enjoyed the program. Have a wonderful afternoon. This program will be available later today on my website at libertariat.wordpress.com. I do have a new website on the way with, I believe, 2 new contributors. I'll have lots of content flowing on the new website. We'll have more details on that. Please feel free to email me at libertariat@gmail.com. If you'd like to request a show topic, I'll be happy to discuss something that you don't think is getting enough airtime. Be happy to cover that. libertariat@gmail.com. The website, libertariat.wordpress.com. Have a wonderful Tuesday.